the world is fragmenting and the world is also becoming more radicalized. In fact, what we are witnessing is the beginning of a process of global paradigm shift. That is to say, the world's energies are undergoing profound change and will reorganize our world in the years to come. But this inevitably involves a period of crisis. And the conflicts we see emerging in the world today are only at the beginning of this crisis process and therefore of transformation, such as the war in Ukraine, which is one example of rising tensions and this period of crisis, but also the catastrophic situation in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians. So these conflicts that we see on the outside are also, and we must always keep this in mind, reflections of what is happening within our own societies. That is to say, there are conflicts between states, but there are also tensions and crises within our societies. And likewise, these crises within our societies are reflections of the crises taking place within ourselves. In astrology, this is what we call the macrocosm and the microcosm. The macrocosm, that is the state of the positions of the planets in the sky, is a reflection of what is happening in the microcosm, meaning within our own societies. But as you have understood, what happens in our own societies is also a reflection of what is happening psychologically within us. Everything is connected, everything is actually intertwined. So it is particularly interesting to observe and study this change, this period of global paradigm shift, through the lens of astrology, because as you know, or perhaps you don't, astrology is the science of cycles. It studies cycles, everything is cyclical, and that's it. Astrology, the science that studies cycles. So if we understand where today's situation comes from, that is, which cycle it is part of, then we will understand how long this situation will last and where it is heading. And that's really the whole point of this video. So we are mainly going to focus on the slow-moving planets because, as you know, in astrology, it is the slow-moving planets that govern mundane astrology, so they regulate the major planetary cycles of the world and of humanity. And it so happens that between the years 2023 and 2026, so over a period of 3 to 4 years actually, the 4 slowest planets in astrology in our planetary system, in other words, these planets are Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, and Saturn. These 4 slowest planets are going to change signs. Within a relatively short period, 3 or 4 years, no more. And that is very rare on the scale of humanity. 4 of the slowest planets in astrology changing signs. So this too is truly the sign of a global paradigm shift. That is to say, the energies that weave our world are undergoing a profound transformation. And so that's what we're going to study in this video. See you in a moment. Whether you know astrology or not, it doesn't matter. You'll see I have a way of explaining things that will allow you to follow the astrological reasoning without too much trouble. So, paper and pencil for those who already know and want to take notes. Okay, let's get started. We'll go through these planets in order. The first planet we're going to focus on is, of course, Pluto. But first, let me explain it to you here. So, I'm going to introduce the characters before we act out the scene, if you will. That's always how it goes. So, Pluto, it's the planet of Scorpio. It's the slowest planet in the entire planetary sequence. On average, it takes 250 years to go around the zodiac, so it changes signs about once every 20 years again on average. So a sign change for Pluto once every 20 years is always an event. It's something that brings about a major energetic shift in the world. So it happens that, as you can see, Pluto is currently here. We are in June 2024, and it is right at the very beginning of the sign of Aquarius. In fact, Pluto is in the process of transitioning, a transition between the sign of Capricorn and the sign of Aquarius. This transition began in the spring of 2023 and will end at the end of 2024, in November 2024. That is to say, until November 2024, Pluto will be moving back and forth between Capricorn and Aquarius as if it were hesitating to make its change of sign. And the closer we get to the end of this year, 2024, the more it will naturally be in the sign of Aquarius. Pluto, the planet of Scorpio, what does it represent? Pluto represents underground forces, if you will. Individually, these are our instincts, but on a global scale, they are underground forces, like a volcano that erupts at certain times. And so when a volcano erupts, by the way, you have this Plutonian symbol you see here, we extend it here. and then you have a volcano, here you have the crater, and here you have the reservoir with the lava, and so Pluto regularly erupts. So when it erupts, it's the release of its underground forces, and just like with a volcano, it causes a lot of damage. That is, it can destroy an entire surrounding region, but it's also on the slopes of volcanoes that you find the best vineyards. So it also fertilizes the regions, because everything that comes out from the depths of the earth then goes on to fertilize the land and thus encourages a rebirth. So as you can see, Pluto is a planet of transformation, mutation, metamorphosis, but it goes through phases of eruption and destruction before phases of rebirth. Did I sum up Pluto well? Let me know in your comments. So Pluto was, for the previous 20 years, in the sign of Capricorn, a sign of Earth. It's an Earth sign, a sign of control. And so the Plutonian forces were rather controlled in the sign of Capricorn. They were under control. They were kept under the strict control of the sign of Capricorn. And then how Pluto in Capricorn built up a certain frustration, meaning that in the crater it really accumulated. And now Pluto is starting to enter the sign of Aquarius, which is very different. All consecutive signs are very different, energetically speaking. The sign of Aquarius is an air sign, and it's the sign of freedom, of liberation. You see, just as air sets things free, so as Pluto enters the sign of Aquarius, it is in the process of freeing itself, and thus symbolically of releasing those underground forces that had been somewhat suppressed during the previous phase, the Capricorn phase. So here in this transition of Pluto from Capricorn to Aquarius, we are witnessing a release of forces that have been held back for far too long. So what is Pluto like in the sign of Aquarius? You can look at the astrological solfège. There I have all the planetary positions in this set, all the positions of the planets in the signs, so it allows you to learn this symbolic language of astrology. Pluto in Aquarius is not in a position of exaltation, rulership, or fall, any of that. So, well, it seems neutral. But actually, it's rather good in the sign of Aquarius. Why? Because there is still a natural affinity between Aquarius and Scorpio, in the sense that Uranus, which is the planet of Aquarius, is exalted in the sign of Scorpio. You see, there is still... they're like distant cousins by marriage, if you will. And so... this affinity is found in a rebellious side, a side that revolts. And why is that? Precisely because the volcano that awakens, rebels, blows off a cap, and Aquarius is also a sign of emancipation. And so you see, in Pluto in Aquarius, we find deeply rebellious revolutionary forces to revolt against an authority, against a restrictive system, in order to free oneself, to break free. You see? That's the principle. So this affinity, we're really going to find it now in Pluto in Aquarius. And what does that mean in practice? How is it already manifesting? Through tensions within societies. The sign of Aquarius is the sign of society. You see? So profound social transformations, but also marked within states as well, but also marked by tensions, by revolts. So we've already seen examples of this in our societies in France, in mainland France. But for example, the situation in Noumea today is typical of Pluto in Aquarius. Do you see? That's exactly it. So uprisings, insurrections, revolts, and always with the goal of gaining more independence or freedom. So there you have it. Well, this obviously creates significant global tensions, widespread worldwide conflicts, and for example, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is also one of the clearest examples of Pluto entering the astrological sign of Aquarius. You should know that Pluto also represents nuclear power, you see, and so in these crises where each side is claiming a part of the other's territory, each side is demanding more freedom, more independence, more autonomy. There can also be the involvement of the nuclear threat, of nuclear power and weapons in these tensions. This is exactly what we saw with the start of the war in Ukraine from February 2022. You can see that this was just before Pluto began to enter the sign of Aquarius. In fact, these were already the early signs of this impending war. You see, here we're talking about a single planet, Pluto, changing signs. Granted, it's the slowest, but you can already see the transformations that have taken place in the world since Pluto entered the sign of Aquarius. Well, this is just the beginning of a process, because 3 other planets will also change signs in the coming years. Alright, so that's it for Pluto. And now let's look at these planets here. You can see that Saturn and Neptune are also slow-moving planets, and they are currently, as of June 2024, at the end of the sign of Pisces. And so these 2 planets, Saturn and Neptune, will gradually move throughout the year 2025. So just like Pluto, which was hesitating between Capricorn and Aquarius from 2023 to the end of 2024, Saturn and Neptune will be making this transition from Pisces to Aries throughout 2025. They will move from Pisces to Aries between March 2025 and March 2026 over the course of a year. Now I'll show you what that looks like on the next chart. Here we are now in March 2026, and look at what happens. In fact, Neptune and Saturn are both at 1 degree in the sign of Aries. So they have both completed their transition, and they have definitively entered the sign of Aries. This means that the entire year of 2025 will be marked, just like with Pluto earlier, by this phase of transition between Pisces energies and Aries energies. Alright, so let's keep it very simple. What does Neptune represent? Well, first of all, Neptune is the planet of Pisces, that's true. It's a very slow-moving planet. It takes 164 years to go around the zodiac. It changes signs once every 14 years. You see, it's the same as with Pluto. It's an event when it changes signs. And Neptune represents here, let's keep it simple, ideals. The ideals I mentioned earlier, weakened ideals. It's about ideals here. So philosophy, spirituality, religion, and so on. And then there's Saturn. Saturn is a planet. Slow, yes, but faster than Neptune. It takes 29 years to go around the zodiac, and it changes signs every 2.5 years on average. And Saturn, to put it simply as well, represents the structures of our society. You can picture metal beams or stone pillars. Those are the pillars of our society. So these 2 planets were at the end of the sign of Pisces up until now. And that's important because this transition between Pisces and Aries is even more significant than between Capricorn and Aquarius, because here we're really at the very beginning of the zodiac cycle. Aries is the first sign. It's the sign that sets the whole zodiacal sequence in motion. So here, with Pisces, we're at the end of a great cycle, and with Aries, we're at the beginning of a new cycle. So this transition is extremely important. It's even more pronounced than before. So these Neptunian ideals at the end of the sign of Pisces, yes, Neptune was in its domicile in Pisces for much of the previous years, but at the end of the sign of Pisces, things have to move on, things have to dissolve. Symbolically, Aries is the moment when a new seed is planted in the earth, but to plant this new seed at the end of the sign of Pisces, you have to clear the land, you have to turn the soil, dig it up to prepare for this planting. Do you agree? It's only logical. And so, at the end of the sign of Pisces, what we witness, energetically speaking, is a dissolution of energies, a dissolution of things. We have to dissolve things so that on this fresh foundation, something new can emerge, in this case, Aries. So those Neptunian ideals at the end of the sign of Pisces have been weakened. And that's what I was talking to you about earlier. Ideals are beliefs, our adherence to a philosophy of life, to a spirituality. All of that has been weakened recently in the past few years by Neptune's passage at the end of the sign of Pisces. And these ideals are no longer strong enough to hold society together. And it's thanks to this emptiness that we'll be able to start a new Aries cycle and so on. But let's remember one thing, ideals weaken, and then it destroys the structures, the metal beams, the pillars. Do you remember the society? It's the same at the end of Pisces. These pillars have been eroded away, undermined a little, and gradually dissolved by the water of Pisces. So we have social ideals and the social structures that were thoroughly tested and significantly weakened at the very end of Pisces, which actually completely dissolved. So that already helps us understand a lot of things. And so, starting from the year 2025, between March 2025 and March 2026, these planets, Neptune and Saturn, will gradually become infused with the next energies, that is, Aries energies. But it's a brand new beginning for them. So they don't really know these Aries energies yet. So it's awkward. And so when we discover new energies, when we start to absorb new energies that we're not used to, we're awkward, we don't know how to do it well, we don't know how to use them constructively. So what will Neptune and Saturn first absorb in the sign of Aries? Sign, which is the sign of Mars of war. They will absorb a kind of aggressiveness, a kind of aggressiveness, combativeness, typical of Mars. So up until now, they were completely passive, almost to the point of being dissolved. And now, as they enter the sign of Aries in 2025, they receive here, take your helmet, here's your sword, here's your shield, go on, assert yourself, go to war, make your mark your territory, set your boundaries, say who you are, claim your personality, your individuality, and defend your borders. That's what's happening. And it's awkward because it's at the very beginning of the sign. So more concretely now, what should we expect when Neptune enters the sign of Aries? Neptune represents everything related to religion, philosophy, spirituality. And now it takes on the combative Aries energy. You see? But clumsily. So, from the year 2025 onwards, we will inevitably see the significant emergence of profound battles, intense crises, and widespread conflicts that are fundamentally based on deeply held religious beliefs and philosophical ideologies. What is happening there in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians is the beginning of Neptune entering the sign of Aries. Beginnings, you see? Thank you. Once again, Neptune will remain in the sign of Aries for 14 years. But it's especially in the first years when a sign changes that the energies are clumsy and can get out of control. So, in 2025 and 2026, we should expect conflicts based on religious, spiritual, and philosophical grounds, of course, associated with all that. So, with everything that comes as a corollary to these religious crises, that is, of course, wars, but also potentially attacks, etc., because it's clumsy. Saturn in the sign of Aries. How is Saturn in the sign of Aries? It's good, it's not good, so it's the same. Here I also refer you to the astrological domino. It's about planetary rulerships. It's a simple little game, but it really helps you practice planetary rulerships effectively. So how is Saturn in the sign of Aries? Well, it's in its fall. That's the technical term in astrology. But don't worry. What does fall mean? It means it's not doing well. It's not comfortable in this sign. Why? Because Saturn is normally the planet of Capricorn, but Saturn is exalted in the sign of Libra. Saturn in Libra, if you will, is the scale's beam, meaning the central axis of the scale, which represents law and justice, and therefore balance. Law and justice make balanced decisions by taking both sides into account. That's why Saturn exalted in Libra represents law, justice, balance, but also a form of diplomacy. It's diplomacy. But diplomacy today is what's disappearing. And it's normal that it's disappearing. In quotes, it's normal. It shouldn't be, but it is disappearing. What the world is lacking right now are diplomats. In France, we're doing exactly the opposite. That is, we're getting rid of the diplomatic corps and replacing them with civil servants taken from all over the place. And you'll see the damage. Well, we don't see it yet, but you'll see the damage this will cause to French diplomacy around the world. So, to say that Saturn in Libra represents diplomacy beyond the law, and so when this law, and in the sign of Aries, in the opposite sign, it is in its fall. And why is that? Because Aries is the individual fighter who sees exclusively, essentially, only his own side. He can't take into account the opposing side, and therefore the opposing opinion or point of view. He acts entirely based on his own point of view and mainly acts in a combative, aggressive manner. So here you have the Saturnian law that is in its fall in the sign of Aries. And here we have the whole sequence of law being enforced, law being imposed by force, power, authority that is imposed by force, that is forced upon others. And without taking into account the prevailing law, or the universal law, or the social law. So for example here, to take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an example, that's what it is. That is to say, you have someone, an authority, Netanyahu, who takes combative control of a country and disregards the law, the UN, the International Court of Justice, and carries out acts of war under the sign of Aries, for example. But it's the same thing. Somewhere in the Ukrainian conflict, whether on the Ukrainian side or on the Russian side, that is to say, one disregards the law and asserts one's combative nature. One imposes oneself. There's a somewhat tyrannical side to Saturn in Aries. Saturn will remain in the sign of Aries for 2.5 years. The entire period ahead up until 2028 will be marked by these religious conflicts and aggressive shows of force, sources of conflict and war. Unfortunately, but that's what we should expect. So also in this conjunction, because you see there's a celestial conjunction here, which will take place in February 2026, so just before. And what does this Neptune-Saturn celestial conjunction itself signify? It often refers to a conjunction that is found in cases of oppressed, dispossessed, impoverished peoples during phases of societal pauperization. So at that time we may find people who are uprooted, exiled. In fact, that's already somewhat the case in Gaza right now, and also in Ukraine. But also an impoverishment of certain segments of the population, potentially. Because Neptune represents dissolution and Saturn as well, we're dealing with this idea of restriction, even deprivation, you see. So here we have something poor, everything is taken away, things are torn from us, what we once had is removed. For example, one might find oneself poor here, populations may find themselves impoverished, and as a result, they incorporate within themselves the combative energies of Aries. And so they fight for their survival, in this case for their rights, but also and above all for their survival at this level. To fight, of course, here, we'll come back to the sextile later, but you can see how Pluto will fuel this, creating uprisings within societies themselves. Alright, so that's it for Neptune and Saturn. Now we're going to look at the fourth planet, which is Uranus. Uranus now, just like earlier, I'll quickly introduce the actor, or rather the actress in this case. Uranus is the planet of Aquarius. It's a slow-moving planet, taking 84 years to complete a circuit of the zodiac, so it changes signs every 7 years. Every 7 years we see this pattern. It's quite pronounced with Uranus. Every 7 years there's a change of cycle. So Uranus, as you can see, we are in March 2026 and it is located at the end here. So in March 2026 it is still at the end of the sign of Taurus here. Well, over the course of 2025 it will move into the sign of Gemini. So I'll show you what that looks like here. There you go. Here we are in May 2026, so that's 2 months after March. When Neptune and Saturn had definitely entered the sign of Aries, well, here in May 2026, Uranus has definitely entered the sign of Gemini. And actually, just like earlier, it will have made its transition, okay, like this, between Taurus and Gemini throughout the year 2025. So between July 2025 and May 2026, Uranus will go back and forth between Taurus and Gemini, and starting from May 2026, it will enter the sign of Gemini for good. So this too, you see a fourth planet changing signs in such a very, very short period of time. This is really rare in astrology. A change in the global paradigm. So what does Uranus represent? Uranus is inventiveness, it's science, creative genius. And then it's also independence, since it's the planet of Aquarius, where it represents the principle of emancipation, liberation, and therefore independence. How was it in the sign of Taurus? There would be a lot to say about that. I also made a video, I'll put it here for you, about Uranus in the sign of Taurus, Uranus entering Taurus. There's a lot to say. You could write an entire book or make a whole video about it. I invite you to check it out, by the way. And I made a video called Get Ready for Uranus Entering the Sign of Gemini. So that's the latest video I made, the impact of Uranus in the sign of Gemini. Now let's keep it very simple here. What was Uranus like in the sign of Taurus? First of all, Uranus in Taurus, again, in astrological terms, Uranus in Taurus was in its fall. Why? Because Uranus is exalted in the sign of Scorpio, so when it's in the opposite sign, in Taurus, it's in its fall. A bit like earlier, with Saturn being in its fall in the sign of Aries, it doesn't do well there. Uranus wasn't comfortable in the sign of Taurus either. It was restricted. Taurus is an earth sign, Uranus is an air planet, so it was constrained, it was held back, a bit like Pluto when it was in the sign of Capricorn. So Uranus couldn't really express itself fully in the earthy sign of Taurus. However, it built up a lot of frustration there. And now, starting from over the course of 2025 and definitely from May 2026 onward, in the sign of Gemini, it will be set free, it will be reborn and release all the frustration it previously accumulated in the sign of Taurus. So why is that? Because Gemini is an air sign. It's a sign that's very much in harmony with Uranus. It's a sign of communication, movement, language, learning and discovery. And so Uranus in Gemini will bring, well, again, I have to get to the point here, but major breakthroughs in the scientific field. And in particular, everything related to language. So here, I'm especially thinking of artificial intelligence. There's going to be an explosion of artificial intelligence. This is truly scientific inventiveness in the sign of language and communication, which is Gemini. So this explosion of artificial intelligence will happen over the next 7 years, between 2025 and 2032. We're going to witness an explosion of artificial intelligence that will completely disrupt and redefine our social connections, our work, and our place in society as human beings. And that's going to be intense. So this could also explain why in 2026, as we saw earlier, there's this tendency toward a impoverishment of the population, meaning that there is a segment of people who find themselves poorer, essentially stripped of something, and perhaps they've specifically been deprived of their jobs and therefore indirectly of their income because of this explosion of artificial intelligence across all areas of life. So this is redefining work and the economy in a certain way, with probably a lot of people becoming unemployed in the coming years, despite what the media says. Thank you. They want to tell us, of course, to reassure us, to help us swallow the pill. Obviously, we should expect mass unemployment as a result of this explosion in artificial intelligence. But we will also certainly see innovations in the field of transportation, which is also characteristic of Gemini. So the way we get around will certainly be impacted, of course, Uranus, electricity. Will electric cars really dominate in the coming years? Personally, I'm not at all convinced of that. But anyway, we're going to see a lot of surprises in the field of vehicles, propulsion, and how we get around. So artificial intelligence, scientific innovation, transportation, and so on. And as I mentioned, Uranus, the planet of Aquarius, represents independence. The sign of Gemini is the sign of multiplicity, meaning that when you're a Gemini, you do lots of things at once. Well, here, independence will become fragmented. It will also break apart. It will be completely scattered in the sign of Gemini. So demands for autonomy, demands for independence will certainly multiply over the next 7 years, but especially in the first years of Uranus. In the sign of Gemini, that is in 2025, 2026 and 2027, we will really see a multiplication of demands for autonomy, like for example, what we are witnessing today in New Caledonia, where there are major tensions precisely about whether or not the island should be autonomous from mainland France. And I think this is part of a decolonization process, but also of increasingly strong demands for autonomy all around the world in the coming years. All right, now I suggest that I think it's time to take a step back because we've seen a lot, and now it's time, and this is very important when practicing astrology, it's what I teach in my courses, to dive into the astrological data, but also to be able at certain moments to rise above, to take a step back and look at the big picture, as they say, to see things from a distance and get a sense of where we're heading. So that's what we're going to do right now. If we take a step back, what do we notice? What do we notice? We notice that we're moving from a world dominated by earth and water to a world that will be dominated by fire and air energies. Why? So follow me, take a look. Because we had Before 2023, Pluto was in the Earth sign of Capricorn. We had Neptune and Saturn in the sign of Pisces, a water sign, and we had Uranus in the Earth sign of Taurus. All right. And now, look, we've truly moved from an earth-water world to an air world. Why? Because Pluto is entering the sign of Aquarius, an air sign. Neptune and Saturn are entering a fire sign. Aries and Uranus is now entering an air sign, well, starting in 2025, into an air sign, the sign of Gemini. You see? So, on one hand, before, we had earth-water. You have to picture this symbolically. You can imagine a meadow, the earth, with a wetland area inside the meadow, you see? Well, that's the postcard image it gives you. It's stable, it's relatively stable. Stable, relatively fertile, well, stable. And then, on the other hand, you have a fire-air world. So here, you have a blaze, something catching fire. And then, you have the wind blowing. And the wind feeds the fire. And it turns into a huge blaze that engulfs everything. So we've gone from a little meadow with gorse bushes to a blaze that sets the whole meadow on fire. But that's how it is. Symbolically, that's what it is, but you have to go back to ideas like this to really understand the paradigm shift. So we're moving from a tranquil earth-water world to an intense air-fire world, meaning from a rather stable and peaceful existence to a more unstable and aggressive one. This transformation signifies a profound shift. That's exactly it. Unfortunately, that's exactly it. But well, if you've been practicing astrology for several years like I have, you know that nothing is truly good or bad. Everything has its use, its necessity. You just need to be aware and understand things. Now we're heading into a period that's much more unstable and aggressive than what we've experienced in previous years. How long? How long is this going to last? Well, the limiting factor of all these planetary sign changes is, of course, Saturn. Because Saturn is the fastest of the slow planets. As we've seen, it changes signs every 2.5 to 3 years. So that's it. Because there are alternations between the sign changes. So it's a period that's a bit longer than 2.5 years, so 3 years. And so that's exactly what we find. That is to say, this air-fire period will last from 2025 to 2028, with most of the year 2025 and a small part of the year 2028. So 2025, the whole year, and up until the spring of 2028, we will be in this period, in this air-fire period. So we are clearly heading toward greater instability in the world and the emergence of multiple crises, multiple conflicts around the world. That's clear. We have to hope that it won't be too damaging. We have to hope that we have to go through this. It's not about denying it. We have to go through this, but these conflicts must not damage the world too much, because in any case, afterwards, we'll have to rebuild. They need to change the world, but not destroy it completely, because otherwise, obviously, it will be very difficult to rebuild. Okay, so it's a bit like an investigation. This is my magnifying glass, and here I have the handle of the magnifying glass, and I'm looking and searching. It's like an investigation. I like to see astrology as an investigation, like Sherlock Holmes. So we're investigating. Have we already experienced this air-fire period before? And how did it go? So I go back through the zodiac, I rewind, I move the planets, I make them retrograde, and I look for a period when we already experienced 4 slow-moving planets in air and fire signs. It's actually not common. It's not common at all. So the last air-fire period we experienced like this was from 2000 to 2003. That is between the year 2000 and 2003, so again 3 years. Just like between 2025 and 2028, we went through a period when the 4 slow-moving planets in astrology were in fire and air signs. I don't remember exactly, but Pluto was in Sagittarius, Saturn was in Gemini, and Neptune and Uranus were in Aquarius. So you see, we really had an air-fire configuration. So what was the world like between 2000 and 2003? It was a particularly unstable period. That is, if you ask people from my generation, what is the event that has impacted you the most in your life on a geopolitical level? Inevitably, people will answer 2001, 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center and the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, and the change the changes, the major shift in the state of the world from that moment on. That is, you remember, the axis of evil, the redefinition of relationships between powers, and so on. And with these attacks and the start of this conflict, which really marked a turning point in world history. You see, in my videos, by the way, you can find this in several of my videos, especially protecting humanity in a declining world, but also message to the resistance of 2050. In these videos, I explain the beginning of the period of decline and why, etc. And so I place this at the start of the 2000s, which for me is really a moment when the world changed. So that was truly a very important period, and it's not surprising that it's during this time, right in the middle actually, that humanity was in this air fire period. Well, we're about to experience another RFE period again, between 2025 and 2028. We need to prepare for it. Now, when I say prepare for it, it's easy for me to say that. I don't have a magic solution. I don't have a miracle cure to offer you. I just think a bit like on those Pacific Islands where you actually feel very small and you see a hurricane, a cyclone coming. So what do the locals do with their common sense? Well, they start protecting their homes, they close up, they nail down the shutters. They reduce the sails, basically. To use a maritime term, we reduce the sails, we make ourselves secure, we stock up a bit, whether that's internally, philosophically, or in practical terms, food, finances, and so on. To get through this period of crisis, trying to cause as little damage as possible, to suffer as little damage as possible, so that afterwards, starting in 2028, we can regain our footing and, as Pluto has indicated, truly begin a process of reconstruction and rebirth. But before that, we'll have to get through this period of great instability, air and fire, between 2025 and 2028. Alright, so I'll stop here, though there would still be a lot more to say. One thing to mention, I'm not quite finished, is that, you see, we might be inclined to say, and maybe some of you might be inclined to say this, that yes, but look, there are good aspects between all these planets. That is to say, it's true. You have a sextile here, you have another sextile here, and you have a trine. So actually, it's as if these planets are joining hands at a certain point. Through these positive aspects, and so some professional and amateur astrologers will say, yes, but this isn't a crisis at all. On the contrary, it's a factor of stability and harmony. Yes, but actually no, these are astrological mistakes. The sextile and the positive aspects, the trine and the sextile, these are harmonic aspects. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that these are good aspects in the sense that everything will go well just because there are sextiles. Not at all. It means that, in fact, they facilitate communication between planets. That is, if you have a trine, if you have a sextile, the communication between those two planets is facilitated. That's all it means. That's why we say it's a misuse of language when we call it a good aspect. No. It's an aspect that facilitates communication between the planets. So, when you have this configuration here, you have communication that is made easier between these three groups of planets: Pluto, Neptune, Saturn, and Uranus. Does that mean it's harmonious, facilitating, that things will go well, that it will be peaceful? Actually, not at all. And why is that? Because you have to understand, and that's what we've done in this video, and what needs to be done in this video, is that you have to understand the celestial state of the planets in the different signs. Is Pluto peaceful in the sign of Aquarius? Not at all. We've seen these sources of insurrection, uprising, revolt, etc. Is Saturn well placed in the sign of Aries? Not at all either. It's in its fall. Remember the tyrant, the use of force. Is Neptune, the planet of Pisces, well placed in the sign of Aries? What do you think? Not at all. We've seen that it carries a risk of religious fanaticism, of a source of crisis and conflict on religious, spiritual and philosophical grounds. So it's not a good state. The best state, if anything, is Uranus in the sign of Gemini. But let's say it's neutral here. Yes, Uranus will be able to unleash its energies in the sign of Gemini, but it's neither really positive, it's not its home, it's not exalted, nor really negative. So it's neutral. It's a scientific explosion and a multiplication of independences or demands for independence. It's relatively neutral. But all of this will feed into itself, you see, through the trines and sextiles. And since all of this points toward instability, air and fire, and a marked aggressiveness, as well as revolt and tension, Aries and Aquarius, even though these aspects might seem to the uninitiated, I would say, to be a source of stability, no, on the contrary, it's going to be a crisis. And this crisis, I see it as a build-up in intensity. So it's already happening in 2024 with Pluto, just Pluto for now, but it's going to intensify in 2025 and will most likely reach its peak in 2026. So the years 2025 and 2026 are going to be years of great tension. What's going to happen is that Jupiter will continue its path here. We haven't talked about this one yet. It's the fastest of the slow-moving planets. And at some point it will come into opposition with Pluto. And for France, we're still talking about 2026. This is really an aspect of revolt. I would say it's potentially an aspect that could trigger a revolt or possibly even a revolution. So I also invite you to check out what I have to say about this in that video. Alright, this time I am truly finished. Thank you for your attention. Thank you as well for sharing this video. The more people are aware of what's happening, why and where we're headed, the better we can all prepare together and support each other through the difficult years ahead. So thank you in advance for your likes, for sharing, and I'll see you very soon in another video. Thank you very much. See you soon. Goodbye.